The first thing Kale noticed about the alien device was that it looked exactly like something his grandfather would have built. That was the wrong thought to have. He knew. Grandpa George had been dead 11 years. The workshop was sealed. The device on the workbench, a nest of copper tubing, crystalline nodes, and what appeared to be a repurposed power regulator from a pre-collapse transit system, had no business looking like anything human-made. It was alien. They had determined that much. The xenotechnology team at Station Crestfall had spent 8 months determining that and precisely nothing else and yet, Kale set down his scanner and leaned closer. The crystalline nodes were arranged in a radial pattern he recognized, not from any database, from memory. Saturday afternoons in a cluttered garage in the New South Wales Highlands, Grandpa George's hands moving through a solder haze, explaining the principle of recursive harmonic resonance with the patience of a man who believed his 12-year-old grandson would eventually understand. He never did, quite. But he remembered the shape of it. The flower-like arrangement of components, each one feeding signal back into the one before it. "You're doing that thing again," said Priya. He straightened. Corporal Priya Vasquez was leaning against the workshop doorframe, arms folded, watching him with the tolerant expression she reserved for his worst habits. "What thing?" "The thing where you stare at something dangerous and get a look on your face like you've seen it before." "I have seen it before. You've seen an alien device that predates our first contact by 300 years before. Not the device, the principle." Off the doorframe and walked to stand beside him. The station hummed around them. The deep subsonic pulse of the geothermal tap, the atmospheric scrubbers working double shifts in the thin highland air. Outside the viewports, the landscape of Meridian Station's ridge was all pale stone and rust-colored lichen. The same view Kale had woken to for 6 years. He barely saw it anymore. "Walk me through it," she said. He pointed without touching. "These nodes, they're not processors. They don't compute anything. They resonate. Each one is tuned to a slightly different frequency, and the frequencies cascade. Each one friend triggers the next, which triggers the next, round and round, until the whole array is vibrating in a harmonic that doesn't exist at any single point. It's an emergent frequency. You can only generate it by closing the loop." "What does the emergent frequency do?" "I don't know yet, but you have a theory." He did. He wasn't ready to say it aloud, because saying it aloud would make it either real or ridiculous, and he wasn't sure which outcome he feared more. "Give me the rest of the day," he said. Priya studied his face. She had a habit of doing that, reading him the way she read terrain, looking for signs of instability. He'd found it unsettling when they were first assigned together. Now he found it steadying. It meant someone was paying attention. "Rest of the day," she said. "Then you sleep. You haven't slept in 31 hours. 32. She left. He turned back to the device. The Vithani had arrived 23 years ago, and humanity's response to first contact could be summarized in 3 phases: terror, negotiation, and the slow grinding discovery that the negotiation had gone badly. The Vithana were not, by their own accounting, conquerors. They were archivists. They traveled between inhabited worlds and documented what they found. And when they had documented enough, they filed a claim of temporal priority, the legal cosmological assertion that their archive predated the documented civilization by a sufficient margin to establish custodial rights. Custodial rights meant, in practice, everything: resources, infrastructure. The population itself classified as protected subjects, rather than sovereign beings. Earth had received the filing 4 years ago. The counter-appeal window had closed 3 years ago. Humans who had not known about temporal priority law until 18 months before the filing had missed the window by a staggering margin. There was a secondary appeal mechanism. There was always a secondary appeal mechanism. Kale had learned in systems designed by beings who considered themselves magnanimous. The secondary appeal required proof of what the Vethani called Threnval, fleet translated as native temporal agency. Evidence that humanity had, independently and prior to Vethani contact, developed and used technology that operated in the same domain as Vethani custodial infrastructure, that humans belonged to the same technological conversation, not as latecomers, but as participants. The domain in question was temporal mechanics, time travel, which was why Kale Morrow, xenotechnologist, sole surviving grandchild of the late George Morrow, amateur builder and professional eccentric, challenged, was standing in a sealed workshop at Meridian Station staring at an alien device that looked like something his grandfather might have cobbled together from spare parts and stubbornness, with 6 weeks until the secondary appeal deadline and the fate of 8 billion people distributed evenly across his shoulders. He didn't sleep for another 14 hours. What he found, through the night with the patience his grandfather had tried to teach him, was a signature. Not a blueprint, not a manual, a signature. The way a composer leaves themselves in a piece of music. A particular harmonic decision, a structural choice, that's technically arbitrary but personally inevitable. The emergent frequency, generated by the device's resonance array, bore the unmistakable character of human-derived mathematics. Not human technology, human mathematics. The kind that emerged from a specific way of modeling wave interference that had been developed independently in about 17 different places across Earth's scientific history, always by people who were working from first principles and following the logic where it led. It could be coincidence. He knew that. The Vithani were 300-odd years ahead of humanity in this particular domain. It was entirely possible they had arrived at the same mathematical framework through their own first principles reasoning. It was also possible that this device, sitting in a sealed workshop on a human station, recovered from a crash site on the Meridian Ridge 6 years before Kale arrived, was not Vethany at all. He took the thought out and examined it carefully, the way his grandfather had taught him to examine a new circuit board. Don't assume you know what you're looking at. Trace the connections. Follow the signal. Not Vithani. Then what? Human. Not possible. The device predated first contact. It predated any human temporal technology. It predated any acknowledged human temporal technology. It was a different thing. His grandfather's workshop had been sealed because of the work George Morrow was doing when he died. Work that nobody in the family had properly understood. Work that the estate lawyers had flagged as potentially significant and then filed away because there was no framework for understanding what it might mean. Kale had that workshop's contents memorized. He had been 12 years old, and it had been the most interesting place he'd ever been allowed inside. And his memory for spaces he loved was eidetic. He called up the estate records from his personal files, the itemized list of workshop contents that the lawyers had produced 11 years ago. He found the entry he was looking for near the bottom, flagged as non-functional prototype, no commercial value. He read it 3 times. Then he sat down on the workshop floor because his legs had stopped working, and he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, and he thought, Gran would have laughed at this. Gran would have absolutely laughed. His grandfather had built a time machine, not a functioning one, not as far as anyone had known. A prototype, a proof of concept assembled from components that shouldn't have worked together, driven by a mathematical framework that the estate lawyers wouldn't have recognized as anything other than an inventor's notebook. But the harmonic signature of the alien device on the workbench matched the harmonic signature described in George Morrow's prototype documentation, a precision that could not be coincidence. Which meant either the Vithani had stolen the design, or George Morrow had succeeded. The device was not Vithani. The device was a message. Kale stayed on the floor for 11 minutes. He knew it was 11 minutes because he watched the chronometer on his wrist. He needed to know how long he was allowed to be overwhelmed before he had to start being useful. Then he got up, pulled out his comm, and sent Priya a message that said, "Wake up, bring coffee. It's worse than we thought, and also maybe not." She was there in 6 minutes, told him she hadn't been sleeping either. He showed her the documentation. She read it twice. She had the kind of stillness that Kale associated with people who processed large things very quietly, containing them rather than letting them expand. When she looked up, her eyes were steady. "Your grandfather," she said, "my grandfather, built a time machine in his garage. In the highlands of New South Wales, yes. Sometime in the 1990s, based on the notation style. And this device is derived from his work, or is his work. I can't tell yet which direction the influence runs." Priya was quiet for a moment. Through the viewport, the ridge was beginning to lighten with the pale pre-dawn that passed for morning on Meridian, the sun cresting the atmosphere in shades of amber that would have been beautiful if Kale had the bandwidth for beauty. If the influence runs from your grandfather to the device, she said slowly, then the device is human-built. And if it's human-built, then it's evidence of native temporal agency, pre-contact. That's the appeal. That's the appeal. She sat down across from him. He poured her coffee from the thermos she'd brought. They drank in silence for a moment. Ch was a thing they had learned to do together. Sit with the weight of something before they started trying to move it. How do you prove the direction of influence? She asked. I go find my grandfather. The silence after that was a different kind. You want to use the device, Priya said. The device is a time machine derived from my grandfather's work. My grandfather's workshop is 11 years in the past and 40,000 kilometers away. If I can get to it, to him, before he died, Kale, I'm not trying to save him. His voice was steady. He'd thought about this already lying on the workshop floor in those 11 minutes. He'd thought about it very precisely. I know the rules, you don't change the past. That's not what this is. I need documentation. I need proof that George Morrow developed this technology independently, that it predates the Vithani, that humanity belongs in this conversation. Documentation exists. It existed, I just need to go find it and bring it back. You're going to time travel to your dead grandfather's workshop to grab paperwork. When you say it like that, it sounds exactly like what it is, which is insane. She paused. I'm not saying no. I'm saying, you need to understand what you're walking into before you turn that thing on. He did understand, or he thought he did. He would revise that assessment later, significantly. The device took 4 days to calibrate. Kale worked alone for most of it. The station's xenotechnology team was small and occupied with 3 other active projects, and Kale had legitimate reasons to request exclusive access that didn't involve explaining what he actually planned to do with the device. Priya handled the scheduling and paperwork, which was her particular genius. She had a way with bureaucracy that Kale had always found faintly miraculous. She treated it as a technical problem rather than an obstacle, mapped the system's logic, found the path of least resistance, and walked through it without making noise. The first day was mostly reading. He treated the device the way his grandfather had always told him to treat an unfamiliar system. Before you touch anything, understand what it wants to do. Every mechanism had a preferred state, a direction it was inclined toward when undisturbed. The job of the engineer was not to force a system into behavior, but to recognize its inclinations and work with them. His grandfather had called this following the logic of the thing. Most engineers found it too slow. His grandfather had never built anything that didn't work. The device wanted to resonate. That much was clear from the first hour. Even at rest, crystalline nodes were generating a faint subsonic hum at the edge of instrument detection. Not electricity, not heat, not anything the station's standard diagnostic suite had a category for. It was the sound of potential, a spring under tension. Kale spent the first day just listening to it, mapping the frequencies, learning the pattern of the cascade the way you learned the rhythm of a piece of music before you tried to play it. The second day he began testing the nodes individually. Each one responded differently, different resonant peaks, different decay curves, but in a way that followed a consistent underlying logic. They were tuned to each other. Every single node in the array was calibrated with reference to every other node, a mutual interdependence so precise it bordered on aesthetic. It was, he thought, beautiful, in the way that very good engineering was beautiful. Not ornamental, but inevitable. Every component exactly where it needed to be, because any other arrangement would work less well. He took photographs and measurements and stayed in the workshop until a 300 read. On the third day, Priya brought him food he didn't ask for and left it on the bench without comment. He ate it cold, an hour after she'd left, without looking away from the array. It was rice and something that had been vegetables before a food processor got involved, and it tasted like everything the station commissary produced, which was to say, adequate. In the way that clean water and sufficient calories are always adequate, without giving you anything to feel about it. He ate it anyway, because he needed fuel, and because leaving food untouched would have worried Priya, and she was already worried enough. On the third night, he found the temporal coordinate interface. It was labeled in a symbol set he recognized as Vethany technical notation. The underlying coordinate architecture was pure George Morrow, the same idiosyncratic way of encoding time as a position rather than a direction, the same insistence on expressing temporal displacement in terms of resonance rather than vectors. His grandfather had never been conventional. He'd thought about time the way most people thought about space. As a medium you move through, not a stream you floated on. You didn't travel to the past. You relocated to a different position in the temporal medium. Same physics, different vocabulary. Cale had grown up with this vocabulary. He'd absorbed it without meaning to, through 100 Saturday afternoons in a cluttered garage, and now it surfaced like muscle memory. And he found he could read the interface with an ease that frightened him a little. He punched in the coordinates, the station's temporal position, the spatial coordinates of his grandfather's property in New South Wales. The date, December 23, 2015. 11 years and 4 months before this moment, 3 weeks before George Morrow's death. He sat with his hand over the activation sequence for a long time. There is a moment, before any large and irreversible action, where the mind offers you a last clear view of the life you are about to alter. Cale had experienced the instant before a difficult surgical decision in the field, the moment before a report that would change careers, the second, before he'd told his parents he was taking the station posting that kept him 3 planetary transits from home. The world always looked very clear in that moment, very complete. He saw Priya's face in his mind, the tolerant expression she wore, when he was about to do something she'd already told him not to. He saw the ridge outside the viewport. He saw coffee going cold in a thermos. He activated the sequence. The workshop came apart into light, not darkness. That was the first surprise. He'd expected darkness, the narrative logic of time travel, the tunnel, the void. Instead there was light, fracturing into frequencies he had no names for. The harmonic resonance the device had been generating for 4 days reaching a cascade point, and then folding space-time around him the way his grandfather had always insisted it should work. Like origami, like taking a piece of paper with 2 points far apart and simply bending it so the points touched. The light resolved. He was standing in a garage. It smelled like solder and machine oil, and the particular dusty warmth of an Australian summer afternoon. And the light coming through the single high window was gold and horizontal, late day light, and the workbench in front of him was covered in components he recognized and one elderly man in a canvas work apron who had just looked up from his with an expression of profound unsurprise. George Morrow was 71 years old, with white hair and large hands, and the kind of calm that belonged to people who had spent their lives expecting the unexpected. He looked at Cale for a long moment. Then he set down his soldering iron. "You're later than I thought you'd be," he said. Cale opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "You knew. I knew someone would come. I didn't know it would be you." His grandfather's eyes were doing the thing Cale remembered, the sharp, careful examination, the reading of a face. "You look tired. Have you been sleeping?" He almost laughed. He felt tears start behind his eyes and pressed them back because there wasn't time for this. There wasn't time. He'd come here for documents and documentation and proof, not for this. "I have questions." "I expect you do." His grandfather turned and pulled a second stool out from under the workbench, the gesture so habitual, so unremarkably George Morrow. Cale's chest hurt with it. "Sit down, I'll put the kettle on." He sat down. His grandfather moved through the garage with the unhurried efficiency of a man who never wasted motion. The kettle went on. He found 2 mugs that were probably not clean. He brought a tin of biscuits from behind a transformer casing and set it between them. "Now," he said, settling onto his stool, "tell me why you've come. Not the reason you told yourself in the middle of the night. The real reason." Cale had not planned to tell anyone the real reason. He had planned to explain the appeal, the deadline, the technical evidence he needed, the documentation, the legal framework, the precise and bounded purpose of this visit. He had constructed a very orderly narrative. It lasted about 30 seconds before he abandoned it. He told his grandfather everything. George Morrow listened the way he always had. Without interrupting, without the reflexive reassurances that most people offered, without performing concern. He listened with his full attention, tracking the technical details with the quick eyes of a man who had spent 60 years solving problems, and when Kale finished, he was quiet for a moment. Temporal priority law, he said finally. Yes. Cosmological legal framework that treats advanced civilizations as custodians of less advanced ones. That's their framing. Humanity missed the appeal window. By 3 years, his grandfather looked at him steadily. And the secondary appeal requires evidence that humans developed temporal mechanics independently. Before first contact, yes. Another silence. The kettle began to whistle. His grandfather poured the tea with the same unhurried efficiency. He passed Kale a mug, chipped, stained brown with years of use, warm in a way that felt unreasonably like comfort, and then he leaned back on his stool and folded his large hands around his own mug. How much documentation do you need, he asked. As much as you have. Notebooks, schematics, date-stamped recordings if you have them. Anything that establishes the development timeline. His grandfather nodded slowly. There's a problem. Problem. The documentation is distributed. I've been working on this for 30 years. The notebooks are in 3 different locations, some here, some at the property near Oberon where I do the fieldwork, some with the University Archive in Sydney, where I had theoretical consultations in the 80s. None of it is organized as a legal filing. None of it would be immediately legible to someone who didn't already understand the work. He paused. You need someone to navigate it with you. Explain what each piece means and where it fits in the timeline. To translate it from an inventor's notebooks into something a court could read. Yes, that's what I need. Then I'll come with you. You can't come with me. You can't leave 2015. I can't take you. Why not? Because you're... He stopped. The word died. His grandfather watched him with clear eyes. I'm going to die in 3 weeks, George Morrow said. Without drama, without tremor. I know that. I've known it for 6 months. Heart. Nothing to be done about it. I've had good doctors, and they're very certain. I've had time to get used to the idea. He tilted his head slightly. Have you? Kale couldn't answer. I thought not. His grandfather looked at the workbench. The half-assembled components. The soldering iron cooling in its rest. I've been finishing what I could finish. Making the workshop as legible as I could make it. I knew someone would eventually come looking. A small smile. I didn't know it would be my grandson. That's a nicer ending than I'd expected. I'm not here to change anything, Kale said. His voice was rougher than he wanted it to be. I promised myself I wouldn't. I know. Not here to save me. You're here to save 8 billion people. His grandfather set down his mug and stood up. The careful deliberateness of a man who was used to managing pain. That seems more important. Let's get to work. They worked through the night. It was the most concentrated education of Kale's life. His grandfather moved through 30 years of documentation with the ease of total familiarity, pulling notebooks from shelves and boxes, explaining the logic of each phase of development in the patient way Kale remembered from childhood, never assuming his grandson understood something he hadn't explained. The theoretical framework, the wave-medium model of temporal positioning, the first prototype attempts in the 1990s, the contacts with theoretical physicists who hadn't understood what he was describing, the breakthrough moment in 2003 when he'd found the emergent frequency. The second prototype, which had functioned briefly before a power failure had damaged 3 of the resonance nodes. The documentation of that first temporal displacement, a 1-hour jump, forward, his workshop to the same workshop 60 minutes later. Did you go anywhere after that? Kale asked. A few times, nothing dramatic. Concept, not adventure. I'm not a young man, his grandfather smiled. I went back and watched myself build the first prototype. Once, to make sure I hadn't imagined it. That was odd. That's casual. That's incredibly casual. It's only frightening if you think about it too hard. He set a notebook on top of the growing stack. The important thing is the date stamping. Was meticulous about dates. Every notebook entry, every photograph, every component order. You'll be able to establish a continuous development timeline from 1987 to the present. He paused. To now, to this. There were notebooks Kale hadn't seen before. 11 years of not seeing had erased the details and left only the impression. The smell of the shop, the warmth of it, the feeling of being somewhere that mattered. Now the details came back one by one. The way his grandfather wrote numbers, the sevens crossed European style, a habit picked up during a research stint in Munich in 1974 and never abandoned. The color-coding system for different phases of development. Blue ink for theory, black for practical notes. 4 problems that hadn't been solved yet. There was a lot of red in the early notebooks. Less and less as the years went on. You spent 30 years on this, Cale said. On something you couldn't tell anyone about. Couldn't publish. Couldn't verify with colleagues. I told your his grandfather said mildly. He was organizing a stack of component receipts by date, handling them with the care he gave everything. She didn't understand the mathematics, but she understood the work. She always knew when I was onto something real and when I was chasing shadows. A pause. She had excellent instincts for that. Better than mine, honestly. I wasted 2 years in the mid-90s on a dead end. She told me it was a dead end in the first month. I didn't listen. Changed your mind. Running into the same wall for 24 consecutive months, eventually made the point. He smiled. She was very gracious about being right. They kept working. The garage filled with sorted stacks. Theory notebooks, prototype logs, photograph albums, component orders. A folder of correspondence with a physicist at the University of Melbourne who had engaged with the mathematics far enough to be useful, and then apparently gotten frightened of his own conclusions and stopped responding. Correspondence dated 1999 to 2001. There were 11 letters from his grandfather and 6 replies, each reply shorter and more carefully non-committal than the last. He knew you were onto something, Cale said. He was a careful man. He had a career to protect. His grandfather's voice held no bitterness. I never blamed him. Him to endorse and had something that in no standing a recognized field. That's a significant thing to ask of someone. Could have published the mathematics, not the device, just the theoretical framework. Built an academic record. I thought about it. For a long time, I thought about it. He set the correspondence folder on its own stack. Problem is that publishing the mathematics would have meant publishing it into a world that wasn't ready to do anything with it. Someone would have taken it, built something, gotten hurt, or not gotten hurt and gone somewhere they shouldn't go. Travel isn't a tool you release into the wild before you understand the implications. He looked at Cale directly. You know this. You work in xenotechnology. You know what happens when powerful systems are deployed into environments that haven't developed the ethical framework to handle them. Cale thought of the Vithani, of temporal priority law, of 8 billion people classified as protected subjects. Yes, he said. I know. So I kept it here. I documented it. I waited for the world to catch up to the point where the documentation would be useful rather than dangerous. His grandfather turned back to the notebooks with the calm of someone who had made peace with a difficult decision long ago. It appears the world did. They sorted and organized and annotated until the pre-dawn light began to gray the garage window. His grandfather made more tea. They ate biscuits from the tin. At some point, Cale stopped working and just sat for a moment, watching his grandfather's hands move through the papers, and let himself feel what he'd been not feeling since he arrived. The unreasonable, specific grief of someone who had missed a person for 11 years was now, for a few impossible hours, not missing them at all. His grandfather looked up and caught him. Tell me about your life, George said, not as a deflection, as genuine interest. The station, this Priya. What the world is like, Cale told him. Not the crisis, not the appeal, not the weight of it, the mundane living parts. The view from the Meridian Ridge. The coffee that was never quite hot enough. The particular satisfaction of working in a field where the problems were genuinely unsolved and the solutions were genuinely unknown. His grandfather listened with the same full attention he'd given everything else and asked questions that were specific and perceptive. And when Cale mentioned something about the work that had surprised him or delighted him, George Morrow smiled in a way that Cale recognized as pride. It was the nicest conversation he'd had in years. He was aware of that at the time. He filed it carefully. Dawn came. His grandfather made him eat breakfast. Eggs, toast, a glass of orange juice, produced from the house attached to the garage with a practicality that brooked no argument. Gran had died 8 years before this moment, in 2007, and the house was quieter for it, but still organized in the way of someone who believed in the dignity of order. Cale ate and didn't argue. "There's one more thing," his grandfather said when they were done. He set a small external drive on the table between them. "I recorded the second prototype activation, video and data, date stamped, GPS tagged, full technical telemetry. I recorded it thinking I might need evidence someday, though I didn't know for what." He pushed it across the table. "I think you need this more than I do." Cale looked at the drive, looked at his grandfather. "You've been preparing for this conversation," he said. "Years." George Morrow shrugged, the gesture so familiar it made Cale's sternum ache. "I didn't know it would be you coming. I didn't know about the Vethani. That's your future, not mine. But I knew someone would come looking, eventually, and I wanted to be ready for them." Pause. "Ready for you." Cale picked up the drive. It was a small object. It weighed very little. He held it carefully. "I'm going to miss you," he said. "I'm going to miss you again." That's a strange sentence. "You'll be busy," his grandfather said. "That helps, I'm told." They stood together in the garage doorway, and the morning was very clear and the light was very good, coming in low and gold across the scrubby highland landscape that Cale had not stood in for 6 years, and would not stand in again for some time. The eucalypts along the property's edge were moving slightly in a wind he couldn't feel. A bird was making noise in them, a lorikeet, possibly. He would have asked his grandfather what it was. But his grandfather was watching him, with the expression of someone who understands that a thing is ending and has decided to be gracious about it. "One thing," George Morrow said. "The resonance array on the device you found, the nodes." "Yes, the leftmost node in the outer ring. It looks like it's functioning, but the calibration drifts under load. You'll need to compensate manually, or your return coordinate will be off." He held up a hand before Cale could ask. "Because I built the original, and I know its weaknesses. The documentation covers it, but you might not find the note in time. Trust me, trust you." "Good." His grandfather put a hand on his shoulder, briefly, firmly, the way he'd always done. "The way that meant this matters, and I mean it, and I love you." Without saying any of those things directly, because they were not necessary between people who already knew them. "Go do something useful." Cale went. The compensation for the drifting node was a 0% adjustment in the resonance cascade timing. He calculated it in transit, working from his grandfather's warning and his own knowledge of the array's behavior over 4 days of observation. He made the adjustment one-handed, on the fly, in the middle of a fold in space-time, with 8 billion people's futures in a bag over his shoulder and the emergent frequency singing in the bones of his hands. He arrived back at Meridian Station at 04:47, station time, 6 minutes after he'd left. Priya was in the workshop. She looked up when he materialized, and her expression moved through several phases quickly. Relief, irritation, relief again, and then the steady evaluation she always settled into. She looked at the bag. She looked at his face. She looked at the drive in his hand. "You were gone for 11 seconds, she said. "By the station clock, I know. How long were you gone on your end?" "About 18 hours. She processed this. "You look like you've been crying." "I was in a garage for 18 hours, Dust." "Cale, I'm fine." He wasn't quite. He would be. He knew how to be fine after a thing. He'd learned it. "I have everything we need." He set the bag on the workbench. He set the drive next to it. He began laying out the documentation, the notebooks, the photographs, the annotated schematics, the component orders with their dates. And as he laid them out, he narrated the timeline, the way his grandfather had narrated it to him, patient and precise, explaining what each piece meant and where it fit. Priya listened. She picked things up and examined them and set them down carefully. She was very quiet. When he was done, she stood looking at the assembled documentation for a long time. "This is enough," she said. "This is more than enough. I know. Your grandfather built a time machine. He was a very interesting man." She looked up. Something in her face shifted, not softening exactly, because Priya Vasquez did not soften, but opening slightly, the way a door opens when it's been locked for a long time, and someone finally uses the right key. "I'm sorry I lost him," she said. "I'm sorry you had to go back there and lose him again." "I didn't lose him again. I got to talk to him for 18 hours. He started carefully repacking the documentation. That's not nothing. She helped him pack. They worked in the particular comfortable silence of people who have been through something together and don't need to annotate it. When they were done, the bag was organized and labeled, and the drive was tagged, and everything was ready for the filing process that would begin in 6 hours. The ridge outside was doing the amber thing. He looked at it for a moment and let himself, just for a moment, find it beautiful. "We need to file immediately," Priya said. 6 weeks to the deadline. "I know. We'll start today." He shouldered the bag. "Coffee first. You always want coffee first." "My grandfather made me breakfast this morning. I feel like I'm allowed." She almost smiled. Not quite. The possibility of a smile was there, which was, from Priya, essentially the same thing. The filing process took 3 weeks. It was not simple. Legal proceedings involving cosmological law never were, particularly when the claimant was a planet with no prior experience in the relevant legal framework, facing an opposition composed of beings who had been navigating that framework for 3 centuries. The Vethani were not hostile in these proceedings. That was the thing Kael kept having to remind himself. They were not malicious. They were bureaucratic. They had a system, and the system had rules. And the rules had been in place longer than human civilization, and from their perspective the process was entirely fair. The problem with entirely fair systems, Kael's grandfather had once told him, he'd written it in a notebook that Kael had now read 4 times, is that they assume all participants enter equal information. Fairness without equity is just a different kind of advantage. He included that quote in the filing. He wasn't sure it was legally relevant. He included it anyway. The first week was taxonomy. Before they could file, they needed to understand what they had. Not just in terms of content, but in terms of legal categories. The temporal priority accord had its own vocabulary, its own evidentiary standards, its own definitions of what constituted proof. Kael spent 40 hours reading translated legal texts with a specialist in cosmological law named Dr. Adezo Konkwo, who had been working on the Earth appeal since the January window opened and who responded to the arrival of Kael's documentation bag with the focusing intensity of someone who had been told the cavalry was coming and wasn't sure they believed it until it was standing in her office. "This is continuous," she kept saying, going through the notebooks. 30 years, continuous record. "Do you understand how rare this is in a Threnval case? We have 4 other cases on record. 2 of them failed because they couldn't establish a continuity. The development record had gaps, and the Vethani argued the gaps indicated cross-contamination of knowledge. Your grandfather never had a gap." She looked up. "He was extraordinarily careful." "He always was," Kael said. "He was also right about the mathematics, which I can only say because our own temporal mechanics researchers have now had 3 years to catch up to his framework, and they've confirmed it, independently." She set down the notebook. "That helps. Independent contemporary confirmation of theoretical validity. That's not nothing." The second week was the technical translation. The notebooks were legible to Kael, but they needed to be legible to a legal panel, which meant converting the documentation into a format that could be assessed by beings whose expertise was law rather than physics. This was, in practice, harder than the physics. His grandfather's notation was elegant but idiosyncratic. The wave-medium model of temporal positioning required conceptual infrastructure that didn't exist in standard cosmological legal vocabulary. They had to build it, term by term, analogy by analogy, constructing a bridge between George Morrow's garage mathematics and the legal language of temporal priority accord. It was painstaking work. Kael did most of it with Dr. Okonkwo checking the legal precision and Priya checking the technical accuracy, and the 3 of them working in shifts in a conference room that smelled of stale air and recycled coffee, building something that had not existed before out of components that had been waiting, separately, for 30 years. "This is what he meant," Kael said. One evening, near the end of the second week, he was looking at the translation document they'd been building. When he said he kept the documentation here and waited for the world to catch up, he didn't just mean he waited for someone to come find it. He meant all of this. The legal framework, the people who could use it. Priya looked up from her screen. The world catching up took 23 years of alien contact and a cosmological lawsuit. Better late than never. Is that a thesis statement or a slogan? Both, he said, and went back to work. The third week was the review session preparation. They had documentation, they had translation, they had Dr. Okonkwo's legal strategy. He was careful and precise, and argued from the mathematics rather than from emotion. Because in cosmological law, emotion was not a recognized category of evidence. Kale reviewed it 3 times, and added 2 pages of technical annotation and removed 1 paragraph that he thought argued too hard and therefore undercut its own point. The Vethani review panel was composed of 3 senior archivists. Vel Kashan, who was the oldest, with a pale bioluminescence along its jaw structures that indicated age in their species. Pretholos, who was the youngest and whose chromatophore cycled through colors. Kale didn't have names for when it was reading complex documents. And Han Morel, barely moved, and whose expressions were entirely illegible, but who had a reputation for the most incisive questions in the Vethani legal system. The review session lasted 2 days. On the first day, the Vethani team examined the physical documentation with instruments Kale didn't recognize, which measured. They explained through the translation system. Not just the content of the documents, but their age, their material composition, their authentic signatures of manufacture. Priya sat beside Kale throughout and kept her hand near his elbow without touching it, which was her version of moral support, and which he appreciated more than he would ever say aloud. On the second day, Han Morel asked questions. This individual, George Morrow, Han Morel said. The translation was slightly behind, which gave the words a weight that might not have been intended. He developed temporal mechanics independently, without access to any Vethani documentation or technology. That's correct, Kale said. This is his notebook. A gesture toward the documentation. The entries are authentic. The dates are confirmed. A pause. The mathematics in the notebook match, within a margin of 0.4%. The fundamental equations underlying Vethani temporal custodial infrastructure. Yes. You find this significant. I find it significant that a human being, working alone in a garage in rural Australia in the 1990s, arrived at the same conclusions as a 3-century Vethani research tradition. I find it suggests that the mathematical truth underlying temporal mechanics is not Vethani property. It's a feature of the universe that any sufficiently curious mind will eventually find. Han Morel was quiet for a long time. Its chromatophores did something Kale couldn't read, and the device recovered from the Meridian crash site. You have tested its harmonic signature against the prototype documentation. The match is 99.3%, accounting for engineering development and component differences. The underlying framework is identical. The device was built by someone working from George Morrow's mathematical foundation. You believe the device was human-built. I believe it's possible. I believe the evidence supports the possibility. I'm not asking you to confirm that the device is human-built. I'm asking you to confirm that the mathematical framework it uses is independently human-derived. He leaned forward slightly. The law requires evidence of native temporal agency. A human being who developed temporal mechanics in 1990, independently, using only human mathematics and human ingenuity, that's native temporal agency. That's exactly what the law describes. The 3 archivists consulted in Vethani, a series of modulated tones and chromatophore shifts that the translation system rendered as a soft hiss of static. Kale did not look at Priya. He kept his eyes on the panel and his face neutral and his breathing even. He had a grandfather's voice in his memory telling him, the moment before a result is always the moment you most clearly see what the result means to you. Use that information. What the result meant to him was 8 billion people. It also meant a Tuesday afternoon in a garage with solder smoke and bad tea and a man who never wasted motion. It meant both things at the same time, and he held both of them. Vel Kashan, the eldest, spoke. The documentation establishes independent derivation of temporal mathematics prior to first contact. This satisfies the initial threshold for Thren Val under Article 7 of the Temporal Priority Accord. A pause. The bioluminescence along its jaw flickered. Further review is required. This review will suspend the claim of custodianship proceedings, while the full evidence is evaluated. Duration, 2 to 4 standard years. A suspension. Not a victory, not yet. but a suspension was 2 to 4 years in which Earth was not subject to Vethani custodial authority. 2 to 4 years in which the case could be built properly. 2 to 4 years that hadn't existed 6 weeks ago. We accept the suspension, Priya said, before Kale could speak. She had better instincts for the moment when to speak and when to be quiet. He would thank her for it later. They walked out of the review chamber and into the corridor, and the corridor was just a corridor. Metal walls, atmospheric scrubbers, the same view of the ridge through the windows they passed. And Priya walked beside him and said nothing for a long time. Finally, 4 years. 2 to 4 years. A lot can happen in 2 to 4 years. A lot happened in the last 6 weeks. She was quiet again. Then, "How are you doing?" He thought about it. "Ask me after the coffee." She laughed. It was a brief and genuine laugh startled out of her, the kind that happens when something is actually funny, rather than just amiable. And it sounded strange and good in the metal corridor, and the ridge through the windows was doing the amber thing again. And he thought, this is the part you remember. Not the session. Not the filing. The laugh in the corridor, the view through the window, the feeling of something very large, turning slowly in a better direction. He thought his grandfather would have liked that. The coffee was from the machine in the station commissary, which was mediocre at best, and dispensed it at a temperature that was never quite right. Kale stood at the window with his cup and looked at the ridge and drank it anyway. Priya stood beside him. She had her own cup. They were quiet together in the way they were sometimes quiet, which was comfortable rather than empty. The silence of people who have run out of necessary words and are resting in the fact of each other's company. He said he knew someone would come, Kale said. He'd been preparing for years. How did he know? I'm not sure. I think he was the kind of person who built things and then trusted that the things would find their purpose. He just made sure he was ready to explain the work when someone needed the explanation. He looked at the amber ridge. He was always ready to explain the work. He sounds like you. Kale considered this. He had never thought of himself as particularly like his grandfather. The gap between George Morrow's homemade genius and Kale's more institutional competence had always seemed to him significant, but maybe the resemblance wasn't in the technical work. Maybe it was in the other things. Patience. The willingness to sit with an unsolved problem until it yielded its shape. The belief that curiosity, followed carefully enough, eventually found something true. Maybe, he said, the device, Priya said, the one you found in the workshop, if it's human-built. If someone traveled back from further in our future to our past. Then George Morrow didn't invent temporal mechanics. He rediscovered them. He was always going to rediscover them, because someone from our own future carried the mathematics back to him and planted it in a crash site where a curious human would eventually find it and recognize it. He paused. Which means the mathematics is already ours, has always been ours, will always be ours. That's a paradox. That's time travel. Everything is a paradox if you think about it too hard. He echoed his grandfather without meaning to, and felt the echo land clean. The important thing is that it's ours. Priya drank her coffee, looked at the ridge. He could see her processing, the methodical working through that she did for every complex problem, following each thread to its implication. The appeal is going to take years, she said. Yes, but we have time now. We have time, and you have documentation that establish an independent derivation, and a device that might prove the derivation goes in both directions. In a tradition of human temporal mechanics that started in a garage in New South Wales with a man who trusted that his work would find its purpose. She was quiet for a moment. That's not a bad position. No, Kale said. It's not. He finished his coffee. It was mediocre and not quite hot enough, and in a plastic cup from a commissary machine, and he drank every drop of it because his grandfather had made him breakfast that morning and told him to go do something useful. And he had, and now it was time to do more. Outside, the ridge was pale and rust-colored and ancient. The lichen had been growing there for longer than human civilization. The star was setting in the particular amber way it set on meridian. The scrubbers ran. The geothermal tap hummed. The documentation sat in a bag in the xenotechnology workshop, dated and organized and annotated, everything explained, everything legible, everything ready for the case that would determine what it meant to be human in a universe that had been debating the question for 300 years without them, Kale thought. We were always here, we just hadn't been asked yet. He crumpled the cup and tossed it in the recycler and turned from the window. Right, he said. What's next? Priya had already pulled up the filing schedule on her pad. She handed it to him without looking up. He scanned the timeline, the full evidence review, the secondary documentation request, the counter-arguments they'd need to prepare, the cosmological legal consultants they'd need to find, the years of careful patient work ahead. He thought of a boy in a garage, following his grandfather into a workshop, and finding a machine that shouldn't exist. He thought of following signals wherever they led, testing the logic, not inventing plot details. He thought of large hands steady over old components, a soldering iron, a tin of biscuits, the unhurried efficiency of someone who believed the work would matter. He thought, we do this by being exactly what we are. Not faster than we are, not more than we are. Not by winning arguments we weren't supposed to be in. By being the thing we already were, anyone thought to ask whether we qualified. Human. Stubbornly, specifically, unremarkably, irreversibly human. He handed Priya back her pad. Let's get to work, he said. And they did.